Mark, what is going on here? Because reading Simone Tisdale and The Guardian and others, there's a lot of fear mongering about Iran, and there's also a lot of talk because Russia and China have come up pretty strongly against what the United States and the UK and its allies are doing in the Middle East. There's a lot of talk about this kind of troika of tyranny, I believe. Did Bolton call it China, Russia, Iran? So your thoughts about the situation in the Middle East and where it's headed? I wasn't predicting that the United States would become mired in an even greater conflagration than it already has. But
Jake Sullivan,
here we are.
Right the week of October 7th, Jake Sullivan wrote in an essay how nice and quiet the Middle East was and how that was enabling the U.S. to get things elsewhere. So this came out of nowhere. No one expected this, right? I mean, you could talk about long-term pressure on the Palestinians, but I, for one, had long figured they weren't capable of active, violent resistance anymore. This whole affair and the Israeli overreaction and the U.S. and Western full-throated support of Israel during it has done so much diplomatic damage to the United States. There was a piece in the Financial Times, again, already a couple of months ago, that spoke to a Western diplomat saying, we've lost the global South. They'll never listen to us again on Ukraine or anything else, right? Well, I mean, not that they were listening to you to begin with on it, but now they're really not. So, they can create their little, axes of evil designations of the year and whatever. This type of propaganda only works inside the West, right? And particularly the US and the UK, but it doesn't work in the rest of the world. And they've lost the rest of the world. And they can't bully them the way they used to, because too much resistance has been shown too effective. Even longstanding U.S. Allies, bandwagoners like Saudi and Qatar and UAE have fled and are looking for options at this point. So no one is cowed by the U.S. anymore. It's a typical U.S. reaction, right? Their authority is questioned by the Houthis opening fire on U.S. and Western shipping in the Red Sea clearly in support of the Palestinians. They weren't doing it before. They say it's because of the Palestinians. They're not targeting Russian ships. They're not targeting Chinese ships. They're not targeting ships of any country outside the West that's not aligned or, as long as it isn't conducting trade with Israel. They're not even targeting Saudi ships. Saudi ships are passing through. And the Yemenis and Saudis just finished nearly a decade of conflict, right? And Saudi ships are going through. So U.S. typical overreaction. They're not capable of diplomacy anymore. They're simply not capable of even conceiving it, of making concessions, of talking. They've got a big hammer and they try to hit screws with it. All right. And that is what they're doing against the Houthis and now against Kataib Hezbollah, the Islamic resistance, whoever in Syria and Iraq as well. They're playing whack-a-mole, right? And it's just as useful. Right. And they admit that. Is this going to stop the Houthis? And Joe Biden said no, but we're going to continue it anyway. Right. And, they've been enduring U.S. airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. And then this is the local resistance to U.S. military occupation of Syria and Iraq. That's just who these are. Right. They're increasing their attacks because of the whole Palestine-Israel crisis. But this is the local indigenous resistance against U.S. military occupation of Syria and Iraq. Yes, they're backed by Iran because they're Shia, right? And if the U.S. can play a proxy war against against Russia in Ukraine, right? We're arming them, we're trading them, we're giving them intelligence, war planning, everything, right? But we're not a part of this conflict, right? Doesn't that apply to Iran? Right? You see the hegemonic double standard, right? They're providing intelligence and arms and training, but they're saying we don't control them, right? So, And I actually believe that the U.S., at least the Biden administration, does not want a larger escalation leading to direct conflict with Iran right now. And Iran obviously doesn't want it either. They're both going to push each other to the red lines, and they have been. But neither one wants this. There are plenty of people in the U.S., even within the government, who do desperately want war with Iran, right? There's only three types of officials in the U.S., right? They're politicians, officials, right? They all want war with Russia, China, and Iran, but they prioritize those conflicts differently, right? They want more resources towards one or the other. Those are the three flavors of the blob. And the Iran hawks are not in ascendancy. The U.S., the Biden administration wanted to take out Russia quickly and pivot hard to China and deal with them. Well, they never got past, the first step there. Now the Middle East has blown up on them and the Iran issue. But I really believe they're trying their best in the clumsy U.S. way to avoid a direct conflict. And we know that there was back channel communications through the Swiss embassy, because the U.S. doesn't have an embassy in Tehran, where the U.S. says, we're going to strike you, don't hit back, right? Unless you want this to get serious. And Iran said, if you strike Iranian territory, Iranian soil, that is a red line and we will respond. So the U.S. is playing whack-a-mole against, local resistance to their occupation in Syria, Iraq, and the Houthis. And everyone understands they're not doing any real damage, right? They've vacated all of these solid positions. They know how to move their stuff around. They use tunnels. They're not doing any serious military damage. It's whack-a-mole. And it's all about their belief that they need to appear strong, and that dropping useless airstrikes and cruise missiles on targets that aren't doing any real significant, change. They're not even effectively mowing the lawn, as the awful bloody euphemism goes, is not really making them appear stronger. It's showing how weak they are. But at this point, they're resisting attempts to blow this up against Iran. And now we have this talk of a ceasefire. The U.S. has actually suddenly apparently picked up what Russia and China and others have been saying this entire time. The only solution to all of this is to get the core of the issue and to recognize a Palestinian state, which they have long done. But of course, the U.S. and Israel don't. And now suddenly, at least the Blinken is saying that, right? They're trying to push now belatedly, too late, right? Far too late. They're trying to push. All right, so we agree to recognize Palestine as long as Saudi agrees to recognize and have peace with Israel, right? So they paper this all over. And the Saudis basically told them to sod off, apparently, that they will not recognize Israel until, basically Israel has to recognize Palestine, and Palestine in the 1967 borders before we'll even consider. So it appears that Blinken's little song and dance routine was far too late and far too late in the day for all of this. But it's too bad. Let's be honest. From a purely non-humanistic, realist, cynical, geopolitical perspective, from the interests of Russia and China, there is nothing that would be a bigger gift to them than the U.S. getting embroiled in another stupid conflict that they can't win with Iran. And they've already gotten far more involved and are wasting far too many resources that could be going to Ukraine for Israel, and now in these strikes in Syria. But if they went to war with Iran, a war that they can't, what would even be the purpose? They're not going to land invade Iran, right? They're not. How could they overthrow the Iranian government? It would just be strikes. And Iran would strike back at U.S. military installations and Israel all over the Middle East. And neither one would do a telling blow, but because the metrics for success are so vastly different, the U.S. would be viewed as inevitably losing that conflict. It would be wonderful for Russia and China. That's incredibly cynical of me to say, but that's me, and I'm sure that thought is in the Kremlin, and they wouldn't go to war to defend Iran, but they would certainly provide assistance. They would do what Iran is doing for Russia now, except more probably, and China would get involved as well. I guess that is one argument that the U.S., the people trying to avoid a U.S. escalation should be making, that it would be a gift to Russia and China if they escalated things out of control. For the moment, it appears that both sides are trying their best to continue to poke each other, but not cross that line into direct conflict. Kataib Hezbollah did announce that they're going to suspend attacks on U.S. bases in Syria and Iraq for the time being, that they would find other ways. And now there's the possibility of an extended ceasefire. But understand that while Iran and Iran and the U.S. are dancing around each other, they're also both dancing around Israel. And Israel wants to provoke that bigger conflict between the U.S. and Iran more than anything else. Certainly the Netanyahu government does. Because as things stand now, right, they've lost. They said they were going to wipe out Hamas, and they're not able to do so, nothing even close to it. Wiped out lots of Palestinian children and civilians, but they haven't done any type of serious, irreversible damage to Hamas. And Netanyahu understands that if the conflict ends here, that's it. His political career is over, right? He's gone. There's a unity government now that's keeping things together. But the polls all show that Israelis blame Netanyahu, and rightly, for everything that has occurred, because he encouraged Hamas to take power because he thought he could control them and demonize them and effectively neuter the Palestinian quest for a state. But he didn't have as much control of them in the situation as he thought he did. So he will be desperate. He will not want this ceasefire to last, right, if it comes into effect, because that would mean his political end. So he's got to do something. If he can't defeat Hamas, he's been talking openly about attacking southern Lebanon, about attacking Hezbollah. Why? Because there's a greater chance of drawing the U.S. into a bigger conflict with Iran, where Netanyahu's effective loss to Hamas, again, the metric for Hamas is just survival, right? Because of the power imbalance between the two. His loss to Hamas would be lost in the much larger conflict, regional conflict that would erupt out of this. And that appears to be what he's primarily thinking, as awful and, again, as cynical as that is. But the late apparent supposed U.S. adoption of this plan to recognize Palestine in return for a greater Middle East peace deal between Saudi and Israel and so forth, that's dead on arrival, because the Netanyahu government has made perfectly clear there will never be a Palestinian state as far as they're concerned. They feel openly empowered to say that, and they don't care what the International Court of Justice says about them, because ultimately they know that when push comes to shove, the U.S. will veto anything against them. We'll stop them. We'll shield them because of the power of AIPAC in the U.S. and the greater, somehow fanatical, general American political loyalty to Israel, which I've never understood. But it is against the orthodoxy of American politics to say anything critical of Israel. So that leaves Biden for very little room to use any type of leverage to try to get Netanyahu to think about anything more than Netanyahu's interests. So the conflict is simmering. It hasn't blown up yet. The U.S. and Iran are still largely trying to avoid direct conflict with each other, but Israel is very much intent on sparking that conflict, and the whole thing is not over yet. The Houthis are continuing to attack shipping. Netanyahu doesn't want a long-term ceasefire, and this is just going to stretch out now into the future with the potential to either escalate or pitter back down into some bloody remnants of the previous status quo.
And maybe we can close on this issue, on this topic, with, you call this a gift or a potential gift for Russia and China. Russia, China, and Iran are all close, both bilaterally and multilaterally, trilaterally, dare I say, in many different ways. Could you just inform viewers about what those are and how this situation stands to only strengthen the hand of Russia and China in this region? Because whether it's Israel contemplating a larger war with Lebanon against Hezbollah, another suicide mission, it seems, whether it's being bogged down by Hamas, whether it's the United States and the UK kind of just throwing useless bombs around, there's not a whole lot being offered by the forces aligned with the hegemon. And Russia and China, as you said, this is a big gift to them, but maybe you could talk about why that is and how they stand to gain.
Now, Russia, China, and Iran don't have a formal military alliance like some type of Article 5 NATO, right, requirements. Nothing that formal. They have a looser, but getting stronger all the time, military strategic partnership, right? Where they're not going to run to each other's defense. You're not going to see Russia launch bombers in defense of Iran. You're not going to see China to back up Russian troops, in Ukraine. In a lot of ways, because of the distances involved and the lack of each of the countries' ability to project power long distances like the U.S. has with their aircraft carriers and so forth, right? They're primarily defensive militaries in Russia, China, and Iran, right? For local influence, local protection against the U.S. That's what they've been built up as. But they're obviously conducting high amount of not just political cooperation, but military and economic cooperation that is strengthening and growing all the time. And they're helping each other in different ways. China is helping Russia in this conflict by not stopping trading and actually increasing trade with Russia. Iran, under much more sanctions for much longer, is more openly, like North Korea, providing military assistance, right? The Shahed drones, which have been subsequently evolved into the Quran and the Quran 2 Black and so forth, but also the potential for ballistic missiles and other technology where Russia is providing the Iranians now with advanced fighters, 5th-gen fighters. So there's a high degree of military, not just political, but military and economic and cooperation that is increasing all the time. And this is 3 very different countries, 3 vastly different political systems, vastly different cultures. It is the most unlikely of military, of geopolitical blocks, and its existence is entirely owed to the U.S. arrogantly, simultaneously threatening and provoking all 3 of them at the same time without any type of realist balancing, between them that, say, Nixon and Kissinger did so well by dividing a communist Russia and China, exploiting the Sino-Soviet rift to draw in China with false as it turns out, promises about Taiwan in order to break up that geopolitical bloc there. They're not going to let that happen again. Everyone is far too clear about where the U.S. stands on things. But again, it's not a NATO type relationship, but in many ways it's more fluid. And right now the U.S. finds itself in a position where if it moves against any one of those three, it overextends directly. It overextends itself, leaving itself vulnerable to the other two regionally, which could cause a more general U.S. hegemonic collapse. They can't even maintain a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine and supply Israel just to defeat Hamas effectively, right? They're short of artillery, they're short of air defense missiles, they're not able to military cope with this, and then they're scared, really shitless, by the potential of a direct conflict with Iran, which would really overextend them. So as Russia, China, and Iran gain in strength and cooperate more and more politically, militarily, and economically, this limits the U.S. room to use force against either one of the three directly, or even, as it turns out now, indirectly. And the window for the U.S. to successfully the geopolitical window before the U.S. to successfully act against any one of them in defense of their hegemony, as they believe they need to do. I think it's not even a question now that it is rapidly closing. I think the window is already closed, because these global economic flows of the globalized economic system that the U.S. set up with Bretton Woods and the WTO and the dollar as a reserve currency, it resulted in money and capital flows flowing east, right? In relative economic terms, the U.S. and the West decreased in importance. China vastly increased in importance. Russia unexpectedly resurged, right, in the last 2 decades under Putin. And Iran has emerged as a major, if not the major, regional power in the Middle East, largely because the U.S. took out Iran's principal opponent, which was Saddam Hussein. More blowback from U.S. arrogance and geopolitical idiocy. And now the U.S. finds itself where every year that goes by, even 6 months, these three countries are, with the economic growth, is translating to military strength over time, right? Military always with a lag time follows economy as long as it's invested properly, where the U.S. military strength in unipolar terms and primacy terms is not what it was 15 or 20 years ago, and is becoming less all the time. And the U.S., again, they're so wed to the idea of U.S. The supremacist ideology of exceptionalism, where they believe messianically that not just are they are morally and systemically and societally superior to everyone else in the world, and therefore they can't compromise, they can't do diplomacy, they can't balance, they can't do any of those things, because it would be, making a deal with the devil, as they see it. Why should they compromise? They're the good guys, everyone else is the bad guys. And they full-heartedly believe all of this. And it's patently obvious. And they believe in this Thucydides trap, right? Speaking of the ancient Greek political philosopher, a rising hegemon, in quick, simple terms, right? Layman's, a rising hegemon or a failing hegemon and a potential rising hegemon, conflict is inevitable, right? There will not be a peaceful passing of power. That was possible between the British Empire and the United States, only because they were so close, right? That's not going to happen with China and the U.S. U.S. believes that conflict with China is inevitable, right? Not in Hawaii or California, but in the Taiwanese Straits, in the South China Sea. And everything the U.S. does now, they're trying not to take their eye off the ball of that conflict coming. That's why Obama's Asia pivot, everything is about China, China, China. But, Iran popped up out of nowhere. And, Russia, you're back again? Oh, God. And now they're all cooperating together. And ultimately, it's going to mean the end of U.S. hegemony, as long as that conflict doesn't take out the whole rest of the world and all of us with it.
Yes, indeed. It is certainly a very interesting historical period that we're in. Never did I think
watershed.
It's watershed moment. Never did I think, the horrific mass murder, 35,000 plus Palestinians, and of course, everything that's gone on in Ukraine. Never did I think that out of that kind of horrific damage comes this huge shift that was already on the way, but it has been accelerated by
this is just going to get worse, right? This is I believe we are in World War III now. Right. But it's not one big, at least not yet, titanic conflict. It's a small series of regional conflicts that keep adding on and piling on to each other without going away. The Syria conflict, is that settled? No. U.S. is still camped out in East Syria, Turkey in North Syria, right? Russia and the Syrian government in Damascus. Now the U.S. is launching airstrikes all over Syria. Can you believe what they're thinking at the Russian bases in Syria while all this is going on, and Iran? There's so much potential for things to blow up and blow up and blow up, and nothing is going permanently quiet again. Nothing is being settled anywhere. And we're continuing to see these tensions spark and spark and spark in place after place, and the fires are just simmering and getting bigger rather than disappearing. And this series of conflicts is all about hegemony against the attempted birth of a multipolar world.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyHaiFong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.